All right, welcome to 7.2. So in 7.1, we learned a lot about difference between ethnicity, race, nationality, some other little things in between as well. So 7.2, what we're going to do, you see the key question, why do ethnicities have distinct distributions? So what we're going to do is kind of look at a few case studies in history and see why certain ethnicities have migrated to certain areas. So you'll see some overlap here, what we talked about in chapter 3. And if you haven't noticed on the recording time, but this is going to be a little bit of a shorter one, just because this is, like I mentioned in class all the time, we want y'all to get the big concepts and then think through things. So this one, I don't want to give too many details, but I did want to give you a few very specific examples. So funny picture, right? You get it? Cats. Ah. Okay. All right. So first one, international migrations of ethnicities. Remember, is what we're concentrating on. So now, for example, here we're going to talk about African Americans. So first big migration wave of African Americans is what we commonly refer to as the triangular slave trade. Probably something y'all learned about in middle school at some point, maybe a little bit in high school already. Just depends on what classes you were taking. But if you look over here in this left map, we can really see where it says areas of national domination. You can really see where this migration from West Africa went. So you have a lot as far as slave trade routes. Oh, sorry. You can see a lot of it went into what is now the United States. A good amount of people came here into the Caribbean, which we haven't done that map quiz yet, but you'll learn a lot of those countries soon enough. But we did have some going to Europe as well, although the higher amount went into um, modern day North America and some into South America. Now, for triangular slave trade, um, this is important. This comes up on the exam sometimes to understand what products, including humans, right? Because they were being traded forcefully, were traded on each of these legs. So what would happen is you would have people here in West Africa, and when we're talking about the origination of the slave trade, since the hearth is in West Africa, one of the craziest things that for people in 2017 to understand is what would happen is people from African tribes would capture other people from African tribes, so prisoners of war or whatever. The reason why they would fight is not because of race in this case, but it would be due to ethnicity, because they're different tribes. So we learned in 7.1 that ethnicity is your cultural background. So what would happen is two tribes would go to war, and then one tribe would take a lot of prisoners. So as the Europeans come down, they would come down and see, says cloth, trinkets, so any finished goods they would make in Europe. So the Europeans come down to Africa, trade with the tribes for the prisoners. Those prisoners then went on this middle passage, which I'm sure you all have learned, one of the worst things in all of history, where they would pack the people into ships, and a high percentage of people wouldn't even survive the journey. So this leg would be slaves coming over to pretty much what West Indies or the Caribbean. So they're mostly traded here and then probably shipped up to somewhere in one of these 13 colonies, eventually the east coast of the United States. So from there, slaves would obviously work on the plantations, farms, and whatnot. So raw materials would go over here to Europe. So you actually see like molasses, rum, things like that. Now, cotton would be a big thing here, other types of foods like rice, whatnot. So they come over here into Europe, and here they would make finished products, and you see, boom, it goes again. So cloths, trinkets, other things down to Africa, and that triangle just continues. So you see, everyone kind of needs the other person in this triangular trade, and it really did go on forever and ever and ever until obviously we have the outlawing of human slavery in these more developed countries. Now we still have slavery in some places. We'll talk about that later on when we get into chapter 7. Some of that's due to ethnic bias, some of it's due to racism. We'll give examples of both. So forced migration from Africa into the New World is kind of what we're thinking about when we're talking about migration of African American, when we're talking about ethnicity. Now, internal migrations of African Americans. So we have two waves within the modern day United States. First one is interregional. So if you remember interregional, All right, so see, connecting between units. Chapter 3, interregional is from region to region. So post-Civil War, whenever African Americans are freed and then they have their actual U.S. citizens become free, what they're going to do is they're going to start to move north. Now, they're going to move north because they're going into cities. Now, hopefully some of you maybe already be thinking this. Why would they be going into cities? Well, they're going to cities because the Industrial Revolution is coming to the United States at this time. So we're thinking late 1800s, early 1900s. So the people need workers in factories. So African Americans are like, oh, we don't want to do anything more of this sharecropping because this has not been good for us in the South, U.S. South, so let's go to the North. So they go to the North, work in factories. Now, after that, we have intra-regional migrations. Remember, that is within a region. So this map particularly is just going to show Baltimore. But if you take any U.S. city, especially in the Northeast or upper Midwest, so Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee area, you'll see very similar things. And this, you can kind of tell in 7.1 when we looked at those maps where you had the ethnic divides or racial divides within the different cities. This is where a lot of that segregation is going to start. So what would happen is, let's take a look at Baltimore here. So you see here, so percent African Americans is purple, 90 and above. So here. So as people go through the years, then you see there's a migration. So it used to be that African Americans would live right in the center of the city because that's where the factories were. As factories kind of moved outside, African Americans moved outside. So they went from the central city, then they moved to what we think of as the outskirts of the city. So that is what we think of as a migration wave. So in Charleston, so there's Baltimore. Y'all can see they kind of go from the middle, and then they're moving out here. But if we look at it from a perspective of Charleston, so this would be like living close to kind of downtown King Street, Meeting Street area, moving out to what we call the neck area of Charleston. If you're going over the Ravenel Bridge, if you take one of your first two exits, so there's East Bay Street and Morrison Street, same street, different names, long story. And then Meeting Street, if you go off on one of those, that's the neck area. So this is like African Americans moving from Meeting Street, King Street, that area, out into that neck area where you first get like the edge of Meeting Street and the edge of East Bay Street. Okay, so if we're thinking ethnic migrations, you have first forced migration into the United States, then you have inter-regional migration, so from the south into cities in the north, and intra-regional migration going from the center of the city to the outskirts of the city. Right? Good. And remember, latest reminder, if you don't understand things, this is kind of a big information, complicated example here, please ask me questions or ask friends questions. And if they have questions, ask me. All right, got to be clear on this. So here's some other examples when we're talking about ethnic migrations, but this is going to be historical examples of racism and segregation that may either cause migrations or caused by migrations. This is in the United States again. So this is something called white flight, which I've learned over the years. I don't learn about it. I thought you used to learn about this in middle school. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. Maybe some of you again have kind of touched on it in high school. But white flight happens at the same time as that inter-regional migration wave of African Americans. Okay, so follow me here. So African Americans are migrating from the southeast United States to kind of the northern cities because they're going there for factories. As they're moving there, you have white people or European Americans, however we want to look at it, if we're going to talk about race or ethnicity, but again, that's a separate thing in 7.1. So you take the people who are white, they see African Americans moving into the cities. At the time, these people, the white people, were living in the cities. So this is when suburbanization starts, if you guys have ever heard that word. So you have a large amount, whites, European Americans, moving from the center of the city, flying, figuratively, they're not really flying, out to the suburbs. So African Americans going into the city, European Americans moving out into the suburbs. This actually started something called blockbusting. Now, let me say, in 2017, blockbusting is illegal, but Let's give you a pretend scenario. So let's say an African American family is moving into Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We're going to work in a steel factory. So they're moving into the downtown area of Pittsburgh. Well, what real estate agents would do is they would go into these white neighborhoods and they would go to the homeowners and say, "Hey, African Americans are moving in. You better hurry up and sell your house before they get here because that's going to reduce your home's value." So then people were like, "Oh, let's sell." So they would sell to the real estate agents, sell for pretty cheap. African Americans would come in. Same real estate agent would go to a family and say, "Well, this is a white neighborhood. You're going to have to pay a premium price for this house, so you better hurry up and pay." So they would sell for expensive. So this is messed up. So if you see this, this is really discrimination against race or ethnicity, which is now illegal. So if you offer one house, it has to be same price for everybody, no matter race, ethnicity, gender, religion, anything. Okay, so that's what happened with the white flight and the block busting. That is now currently illegal. So there's an example of y'all for racism and then segregation as well. And we'll come back to that idea later. So something you're probably familiar with too is separate but equal in the United States. So kind of Civil Rights Act, we're thinking 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even some argue until on today as well. So I'm going to give you some examples of South Carolina how we have this. So the water fountain picture is a famous one. Y'all may have seen this one, but you literally have water fountains for colored or white, which still doesn't register in my brain. But schools were segregated. So if you ever heard of Brown versus the Board of Education, that was one of the key Supreme Court cases that got rid of segregation. And then we talk about equality and equity. So anyway, schools, you would have African Americans that would pass multiple schools in buses to go to what they called the black school because they couldn't go to the white school. So schools themselves were segregated. I can't really imagine that right now in the United States. However, in the United States, in South Carolina, we do have an area of South Carolina near I-95 called the Corridor of Shame. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, this was an area of predominantly African American neighborhoods. The schools were not doing well and the schools were falling apart. So you would have these brand new schools in suburban areas and you have these run down schools in the rural areas where predominantly African Americans lived. So there were a couple court cases, Abbeville, Clarendon County, and they did studies and they were like, well, these schools aren't being funded the same. So even though, so this is remember, this is the 90s and 2000s. Kind of this stuff is being looked at. So even though segregation was gone and we had integration, there's still unequal and inequitable problems throughout the United States. And there's just a South Carolina example for you. All right. So our kind of last big one here, and it's good to talk about separate but equal and then talk about apartheid. Apartheid in South Africa. This was like separate but equal, but on steroids. This was not good. So since we just looked at the Africa map, you guys can hopefully picture South Africa. So what happened here is Europeans come in and they colonize Africa. We've talked about that a couple of times already. Short history of the world, and I've mentioned it a couple recordings, and we mentioned it in a whole class discussion too. So what happens is even after some of the Europeans leave officially and then the countries get independence, in South Africa a lot of the British people, and you have some people from other parts of Europe as well, so the Netherlands and whatnot, they stay in South Africa. So there is a majority black population when we're talking race, but the government was majority white population, talking race. So apartheid, these were laws that literally separated the races and ethnicities. So you can see here, they use multiple languages, but Afrikaan was one of them, which Afrikaan is ironically a Dutch dialect. Go figure, right? It's one of the ironic things there. But you can see this is in two different languages, but city of Durban, South Africa. So under this specific law, The bathing area, which weird for beach, right? Dialects, is reserved for the sole use of members of the white race group. So the beach itself is separated. Um, Now, if you look here, you can kind of tell from this map, and this is the modern looking map, where you would have specific areas where people had to live. So under apartheid, they had neighborhoods where it depended on your race, you had to live there. So in the United States with separate but equal, it was a lot of kind of people choosing where to go. But in South Africa, you were told if you're this race or this ethnicity, you will live in this area. So period. Like there were laws for this. I have met quite a few people over my life from South Africa, but there was one guy I met one time. I talked to him for hours. He ironically is a trainer for Midas now in the United States, but he lived in South Africa until into his 40s, mid 40s, and he was in the army during these apartheid years. So as a white guy, um, he told me some crazy, crazy stories about apartheid in South Africa. So he said you would have specific like soldiers stationed places to make sure that whites, blacks, coloreds would stay in their areas. So you would even have stairways where you would have a white stairway, a colored stairway, and there were soldiers there to make sure no one took the wrong stairways. And one of the other crazy stories he told me. So when he was in the army, they were doing a lot of testing for medical things. So in the predominantly area where the high-ranking soldiers in the army were white, if they needed to test a medicine, they would grab a random black South African, bring him in there, just give him a shot of something and just see what happens. And this guy Mike, the South African, was telling me that he saw this multiple times, and no one saw anything wrong with it, just because they were like a lesser people. So again, apartheid, crazy, 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 crazy example of racism. Um, Now, Nelson Mandela, if you heard him, we talked about this in a couple of our classes in whole class. Um, a black guy from South Africa was in prison for years and years and years, 27 years, because he was anti-apartheid. Gets freedom, gets elected president of South Africa, and finally gets rid of apartheid laws in the 90s. So he has actually a great story. Nelson Mandela does. So, all right. I told you I was going to be a little bit shorter, so it's only the 17 minutes. But those are some really good examples there of migrations of ethnicities and kind of why ethnic groups are where they are today. All right. I'll see you in 7.3.